Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our open house. Thank you very much for coming. We are totally thrilled with the turnout that we have tonight. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to give you some information about a project that township staff and council have been working on and will continue to work on for a little bit longer. That project is an update and redo of the township's heritage bylaws for designated properties. For those of you who don't know, there are 52 designated properties in the township of Cavan-Monaghan. 46 of those properties are in Millbrook and 6 are in Cavan, or what we used to call Cavan. I recognize that we've redone the ward boundaries, but I'm still going to refer to it as the former Cavan ward. The bylaws that designated those properties were put in place in Millbrook between 1984 and 1988, and in the Cavan area between 1987 and 1992. Those bylaws are very outdated. When the bylaws were put in place, there were a number of properties contained in one bylaw. There was a legal description attached to each of those properties and a description of the attributes that made them special and the reason why they've been designated. Those descriptions are somewhat simple, I would say. And it became apparent over time that we need to update the bylaws so that each property has its own individual bylaw. And secondly, we needed to round out the description of why properties are designated so that both the property owner and the Municipal Revitalization and Heritage Advisory Committee and council can evaluate proposals to change those properties. And we need that information to know what we really need to protect. So the purpose of this exercise is really to make it easy for property owners and for municipal staff, committee members, and council to help move ahead and preserve our heritage, infrastructure, and history, but at the same time being fair to those people who have a heritage designated property and want to move forward with improvements to that property. So the purpose of the project is, as I said, to update the bylaws. With this project, the township was lucky enough to receive funding from the federal government. We've been able to hire a contract heritage coordinator. His name is Connor Mitchner, and he's going to give you a presentation shortly. So we've been very blessed to have Connor come and work with us. He has a Master's of Architecture from, I'm going to get Toronto Metropolitan University. Yeah, it's hard for me because it used to be Ryerson, which is where I graduated from, but now they've changed the name. But so Connor's been here since August. He's been working on this project. He's been out to each individual property. Some of you may have spoken with him. So there's been photographs taken, and he's done some research so that in the new bylaw, you will see specific information on what makes that property special and what aspects of that property need to be protected. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to introduce you to the project more fully and give you information about what the proposed format for the new bylaws is looking like at this point in time. We also want to receive your comments. We'll answer any questions, and then township staff, together with our Municipal Revitalization and Heritage Advisory Committee and council, will move forward. There will be a public meeting to come for each of the bylaws. So this is not your last chance for comment. This is basically an education session, an opportunity for us to introduce it to you and get some initial feedback. Are we going in the right direction? So with having said that, I'll ask Connor to come up and we'll start the presentation. He will go through it, and then at the end, if there's comments, questions, we're very much here to answer them to the very best of our ability. I did ask you to sign in at the beginning, and that's to make sure that when we do get to the public meeting stage of the process, we make sure that everybody gets a notice in the mail. We will be putting notice in the paper probably, but at the same time, people who have specific interests, we like to send a notice by first class prepaid mail. So that's what the information is for. We're not sharing it with anyone. It's for our purposes only. So having said that, Connor, if you'll come up and we'll carry on. Thanks so much.
Hello. Thank you all for being here. So my name is Connor. Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. I've been here since August working on this project to update our heritage bylaws. Some of you may recognize me. I've been out to every single one of the 52 designated properties in the township of Cavan-Monaghan, and it is a wonderful township full of amazing heritage properties, and that's what we're here to protect. So if we can go to the next slide, great. So I'll give a brief overview of this little presentation and what we're going to go over. So firstly, we'll talk about sort of the overview of the project and some of the goals that we have. And I'll reiterate a couple of things that Karen has already said. I'll talk about and share some important information on heritage and maybe dispel a couple of myths that people might hold on heritage properties. We'll talk about the process for updating these heritage bylaws. This is part of the process that we're going through right now. Then we'll look at an example of an existing bylaw and then an example of a new proposed draft bylaw to just kind of talk about the format, how it's laid out, and where to go forward from there. Then I'll briefly touch on a couple of the other smaller projects that we've been working on, looking at creating a publicly accessible municipal heritage register. And then I'll give a couple of resources for heritage property owners, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments. So in terms of goals for this project, obviously Karen's already mentioned that we are working to update the existing and outdated municipal heritage bylaws. There are basically two main reasons for this. One of them is to make them comply with current provincial legislation. So as we know, these bylaws were created anywhere from 1984 all the way up to 1995. So that's, upwards of 30, 40 years ago. They're quite outdated. They don't necessarily meet all of the criteria that is laid out to meet by the provincial government. And then the other reason why we want to update these bylaws is to sort of streamline the alteration request or the process of improving people's heritage homes, both for council and staff members as well as property owners, to make it just easier and a little bit more efficient for everybody. We also want to create a publicly accessible register of heritage assets, as I mentioned, and this is supposed to make it a little bit easier to learn about the community's heritage buildings, putting the information out there for all of you to enjoy. And then we also want to work on developing a couple of educational resources on heritage. So working on getting the information out there, for example, on our township website about dispelling myths and misconceptions about owning heritage property, and educating people on the benefits of heritage designation. As a lot of you know or may own a heritage property, there are plenty of benefits and it's a wonderful thing to have. So we'll go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about what heritage designation is not. So it, first of all, doesn't include any interior spaces of a property. When you have a municipal heritage designation, we're only concerned about the exterior envelope, usually the street-facing facade of the house, but it doesn't include the interior of the property. So within the means of, or within the bounds of the building code, you can do whatever you like with the interior. Heritage designation is not concerned with that. It also does not obligate an owner to restore a property to an earlier historical appearance. So for example, if there was a fire or something that caused some lost or damaged features, we're not mandating that those things need to be replaced like for like. What the designations really focus on is preserving what exists today. Heritage designation also does not restrict the use of the property, but it just provides protection from unsympathetic changes and hasty demolition of culturally significant properties. So in terms of what heritage designation is or does represent, is it's a tool that we use to protect significant pieces of history that matter the most to our community. And it's also recognition of the incredible work that most of you homeowners do in maintaining heritage homes, and it can provide sort of a sense of pride in the work that you do. It also represents a step towards sustainable growth and economic development, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide. So we'll keep going on with a few heritage facts. Heritage conservation is sustainable, so it uses less energy and has a smaller impact on our landfills than new construction. A great quote that I like to share by an American architect and preservationist is, "The greenest building is the one that's already built." So it's really important to maintain these heritage resources in terms of sustainability. It's also what makes us unique. So Cavan Monaghan has one of the highest numbers of designated heritage buildings per capita in all of Canada. At one point, it was the highest amount of designated heritage buildings. That's something to be very proud of, and it's something that people come to the township to see. It also, our cultural assets form a great part of our community identity, and it's important to maintain that, that identity. It also promotes economic development, so designation supports community renewal and cultural tourism. As I mentioned, people see the vibrant community that we have here and they choose to stay or build a business or things like that. Protected heritage provides a sense of civic pride, as I've mentioned, and it allows us to look back on our history and share stories and understand how we got to where we are today. So these physical records or these buildings, they're records of history and they provide a sense of connection to a place. And that's an important thing to maintain, especially as a township like this sees a lot of growth and new people coming into the township. It's important to maintain that sort of connection to the place. Go to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about the process that we're going through. The first part of this large project of updating our heritage bylaws is to collect data. So that involves historical research and taking photos and visiting sites. So some of you may have seen me in the late summer, early fall months, visiting each of the houses or businesses around the township, taking photos, speaking with property owners, taking notes. That's all part of the sort of data collection phase. And then all of that gets taken and drafted into replacement bylaws or updated bylaws, which we'll see some examples of shortly. Thirdly, we hold a public open house, what we're doing right here today, to get your questions, feedback, to bring everybody into the loop to kind of offer some transparency in this process. After that, we'll do a consultation with our Municipal Revitalization and Heritage Advisory Committee. And then there would be a 30-day notice going out to all the property owners of affected designation bylaws about the enactment of new designations, as well as a public meeting that Karen mentioned will be held in the future. Then we would hold our public meeting, as well as bring a recommendation to council, and then the council would make a decision on the proposed bylaws. And after that, there would be a 30-day appeal period after the notice of enactment of these new bylaws. So we'll go into an example of one of the current bylaws. So this is bylaw number 8412, and don't worry, I know we can't read it right now. We're going to zoom in a little bit on the next slide, but so this bylaw is one that covers 9 different properties. And as Karen mentioned, we can't do that anymore. Each property needs to have its own individual designation. So that's one of the reasons why we need to update these bylaws. So we're going to look at one example property, and that's going to be 17 King Street East. Most of you will know it. It's part of the crown jewel of downtown Millbrook, the beautiful Second Empire building downtown. So if we go to the next page, we'll see these are the first 2 pages that are that involve this address that we're talking about in the bylaw 84-12. So I'm just going to point out a couple of little important pieces of information in this bylaw because it can be quite hard to navigate sometimes. So it shows the address of the property that we're looking at here. And then if you scroll down a little bit, it basically talks about what's going on with this big list of properties that they have in the bylaw. It talks about them being designated as being of historical or architectural value, and then they're noted as being important components of the village of Millbrook. This is back when it was still the village of Millbrook prior to amalgamation. And then on the next slide, it goes in a little bit more. These are the 2 main most important schedules that exist on the old bylaws. So the first one, Schedule A-5, which is on the left side of the screen. We don't need to be actually able to see it because this entire page and a little bit on the next page is just the legal description of the property as it was at the time. It's very long and it's very confusing. And if you're not a surveyor, you probably won't understand what it means, because I don't. So that's one of the main things that now we write legal descriptions a little bit differently and a lot more simply using different terminology. So that's one of the things that will be updated. On the far right of the page is Schedule B, B5, and that is sort of the most important part of the bylaw. It's what explains the historical and architectural significance of the property in question. And as you can see, it's about 3 to 4 sentences long. That's arguably not enough information to back up why a building like this is so important to the community. So we're going to explain a little bit in the next slide what they break down as being important in this bylaw and what's missing. So here's a photo of the property in question. And what the paragraph mentioning the historical and architectural significance outlines is about 3 features. It talks about the style of architecture, which is Second Empire with some French classical influence. And then it talks about the building having a mansard roof, oval decorated dormers, and heavy brackets. And while these are very important features of the building, it definitely omits a lot of other important features of the that make up part of the historic character of the building. It also omits a lot of the cultural or contextual value. So it doesn't really give a great explanation of why the building is important. It just says it is of both historical and architectural significance to the village. These days, we need a lot more explanation about why it's important. So that's one of the things that we're going to be adding to try to make this a stronger and more easily understandable and sort of easy to back up kind of argument. So on the next slide, we'll go into an example of a draft for a replacement updated bylaw. And again, this first slide is just an overview about how long the bylaw is. We won't be able to actually read what's in it just yet. So the first 2 pages basically cover what's to be replaced in the old bylaw, and they outline sort of the process that I've talked about with introducing a new bylaw. And then the second 2 pages are the most important part. That's what explains the significance and the specific features of the building that we're interested in. So, yep, you got it. So we will go through each of the different features in this new bylaw. This is Schedule A of the proposed draft bylaw for 17 King Street East. Again, it's just one property covered by one bylaw to make it simple and easy to understand. So in Schedule A, it's broken down in a few sections. A general or a description of the property, which is just the address of the property, followed by a approximate location of the property. And this is, it doesn't exist necessarily in the old bylaw, but it's required now by legislation to give an approximate idea of where the property is located within the township. So in this case, it's just located on the south side of King Street, east of Union Street, and west of Distillery Street. It's a simple sentence, but it makes it a lot easier to understand what the building is. And then furthermore, the legal description below it is much less than a page and a half. It is a few sentences, and it's a lot easier to understand. Beyond that is the most important parts, again, of this bylaw. So it's the reasons for designation, which is, again, required by legislation to outline, according to the prescribed criteria that the Ontario government puts out, which criteria the building meets. So we're claiming that it meets design, historical, and contextual value criteria within the township. All of these things are explained further in section 5 below, where there's 1, 2, 3 long paragraphs explaining the history of the building, any associations with notable people or notable events it may have, and things like that. So it's a much more detailed explanation of why the building is important. And then the very end talks about the specific attributes. And this is where we're trying to outline a little bit more of what specifically makes the building so special. And if alterations were to be made, what would we want to focus on maintaining or preserving? So it's a little bit longer of a list, but it makes it easier for both the property owner to understand what we're concerned about from the township's perspective, as well as it makes it easier for township staff and council to understand what our priorities are in preserving specific features of the building. So to be clear, any alterations, even with the old bylaws, do need approval from the township if they have any chance of affecting the heritage character of the exterior of the building. So this list is just to eliminate the guesswork in deciding what elements are important to the building, because it's laid out right here. So we'll switch gears a little bit and we'll go to the next slide. And I'll just talk a little bit about what we're also doing to try to better educate the public and put more information out there about our wealth of historic assets. Awesome. So this is just a sample of what a long list of designated properties look like. This is our heritage register that will eventually be available publicly online, probably on our township website. It's another requirement by the Ontario government that we have a heritage register available. And so what it does, and I'll actually just get you to go to the next slide. It gives an example of sort of each property. It outlines an image of the property, the address, as well as the legal description, the date and bylaw that it was designated under, the rough date, if it's available, of when the building was built, and then a brief description of why it's important and the features that are important. So this is really useful to have because it provides more information. It's easier to, if somebody's interested in researching their property or the properties around them, the information is right there. You don't have to necessarily go digging for it. So this is just part of our initiative to get more information out there and better educate the public on the importance of heritage in Cavan Monaghan. So on the very next slide, I have three more slides. We'll go over a quick summary of what I've talked about here. So heritage designation, it's a tool that we use to protect significant pieces of history that matter most to our community. It's a step towards sustainable growth and economic development, and it helps to create a vibrant community that people feel connected to. And that's really important, especially in a small, tight-knit community like Cavan Monaghan. Designations in this case are not being permanently repealed. I want to make that clear. This isn't an opportunity to de-designate existing designations. All this is the repeal of portions of old bylaws will only be repealed subject to the enactment of a new, more detailed and clear bylaw. So there's no chance of any designations being lost here. And then the other thing I want to make clear is that no new designations are being proposed at this time. That's something that we can talk about if property owners are interested in designating their property in the future. But what we're doing here is only applying this work to existing designations that are no longer in compliance with provincial legislation and they're lacking in useful information for property owners and for the township. So overall, our goal is to make the alteration process easier for property owners and the township staff, as well as provide some transparency, as we're doing here, to the process of dealing with our inventory of heritage assets. So one more thing before I leave. Heritage ownership can be daunting. It can be really hard to understand where to even start if you own a heritage home, or if you're interested in purchasing a heritage home or living in one or making improvements. So there's a lot of resources out there, and we're happy to provide those resources to people, or to at least point you in the right direction. So both on the municipal, provincial, and federal level, there are plenty of resources for kind of guiding you through the process of dealing with the heritage property. There are the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. That's a federal document. The Township of Cavan Monaghan has put out the design guidelines and downtown revitalization strategy that outlines a lot of things, as well as some facade improvement guidelines and tips on color palette selection in order to kind of meet and fit in with the historic character of the township. And then the Ontario Heritage Toolkit has a lot of great resources on how to evaluate a heritage property, as well as the process that we're talking about with designating heritage properties. So these are all available online, like I've said, but on the next slide is my contact information. If there's any other questions, or you want to find a copy of any of these resources, I'm happy to follow that along, or forward that along rather. And I want to thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Connor. That was pretty darn good, if I do say so myself. Now we're going to offer the floor for people who want to ask questions or provide a comment. We would ask you to come to the mic if you are able to and feel comfortable. This is so that people who are enjoying this meeting via Zoom will also hear the question. And I would also like to invite those people who are participating via Zoom, if they would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And you can either, the technical people will let you in and you can participate that way. So please feel free. This is a very informal meeting. We're quite comfortable. And I can tell you, if we don't know the answer tonight, we will tell you we don't know the answer, but we will try and find the answer for you. And lastly, the clerk has said, if you are uncomfortable coming up here, we can take the mic to you at your seat. So having said that, we'll open the floor for comments and questions.
Thanks very much, Connor. That was an excellent presentation. I wonder if you could possibly give us the pros and cons of this approach to the downtown, the rewriting the bylaws for individual properties vis-a-vis a heritage district designation. And I think that might be useful to understand the pros and cons of the two approaches for the downtown area, which is so important. It's the core of Millbrook and its cultural tourism. Thanks.
I got it.
Oh, that does work. Okay. That's a great question. Heritage conservation districts are a really useful tool. They also take a lot of work to put in place. I think one of the main things that we're worried about is the current bylaws are quite out of date, and whether we change the sort of meat of the bylaws or not, they do need to be updated. So it's sort of something that we need to go through with anyways. So we're trying to at least strengthen them in that sense. I don't think that a heritage conservation district is something that is necessarily, I don't think the township would be opposed to that. I don't know how the township stands on that, but it would take work and a lot more investment and a lot more time to put together the sort of research that it would be required to put forth a heritage conservation district. I'm not going to necessarily rule it out in the future, but that's not necessarily my call to make. I would love to see that happen personally, because in a downtown area, especially like Millbrook, there's a lot of, it's a densely packed area full of heritage, and it's something that I could see being a heritage conservation district, but again, it would take time and investment to do. I would say that it could be, but perhaps I'll let somebody elaborate on our thoughts on that. Maybe Karen can.
Thank you. Just for everyone's benefit at home, the question was, is it something that could be pursued in the future? So I can tell you that a heritage conservation plan for downtown Millbrook has been talked about for a number of years. There are policies in the current official plan which talk about that, the potential for completing such a plan. We have not been able to achieve that to date. I don't want to speak for council, but I can tell you, I believe that there are a lot of competing priorities for the tax dollar today. As Connor indicated, it's an expensive and labor-intensive project. We're a relatively small municipality with a limited staff. We would need a consultant to do that for us. So at this point, to be honest, we have not had the financing or the bandwidth to set out on the creation of a conservation plan for downtown Millbrook. I wouldn't rule it out in the future, but I'm pretty sure that this year is a tough budget year. So so the comment was to go for GoFundMe. So yes, so I think probably council would be delighted if members of the community came with, $100,000 and said, here's your gift. Move forward with the Heritage Conservation District Plan. So it's one of those nice to have, but realistically, unless someone on council wishes to correct me, I would say it's not going to happen in 2023.
This gets you to stay there, Ms. Ellis. We have a question from the gallery. The question is, other municipalities provide grant and tax reliefs to property owners of designated property. Is part of the work that is being researched, is part of the work that is being done researching what other municipalities are doing and how these could be implemented in the township?
So this project involves updating the existing bylaws only. This project does not include an assessment of how we might fund or help fund property owners in their quest to improve their designated properties. The township does have a community improvement plan in place right now that every year so far, council has turned on certain programs, like a facade improvement program. Those programs are available to offer limited assistance to property owners. They don't have to be a designated property, but that type of program is currently available. But there's no other research going on at this moment in time. This is a pretty labor-intensive project, and we're trying to get through the 52 bylaws. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
Connor, as you travel around the community, and I'm talking the entire township, I'm guessing that's part of the goal. When you see other buildings or structures that were built roughly in the same time spread all over the community, are you planning to leave any kind of information in the drawer at their mailbox to let them know this even remotely could affect them or could be an advantage to them, rather than a lot of the community thinking this is just a Millbrook initiative? Because there's all kinds of properties that were established in or around or before the same time as Millbrook.
That is a great question. There is again, a wealth of heritage properties throughout the rest of the township of Cavan-Monaghan. Of course, a lot of the existing designations are centered in Millbrook, but that is something that we've spoken about. Is it would be a nice to do sort of thing to be able to consult with the community and get input on what properties might be, or what owners might be interested in designating their properties in the future. Again, it comes down to a time and resources sort of thing. What we're focused on right now is getting through these 52 bylaws. And as one person drafting 52 bylaws, it does take a little while to get through that. It is something that before my contract is up, I would like to be able to set the township up with the ability to sort of do that kind of public outreach and hold public meetings, have that kind of consultation, put the information available on our website so that property owners can reach out to the township if they're interested in designating their property and following through with that process. Again, right now our focus is on updating the existing bylaws, but that is something that we've expressed interest in doing is including more of the township, because as we've said, we only have 6 designated properties in Cavan and then 0 in North Monaghan right now. So it would be really nice to sort of round out those numbers, but I think that would be a future project, probably not for this year.
Anybody else?
While our audience is thinking, we do have another question from our virtual audience. Will the property owners have the opportunity to comment on the description of their property prior to the official update to ensure that the information is correct?
Yes. So that's part of what we're doing here. But like Karen said at the beginning of this meeting, this isn't the only chance to make comments on these new bylaws. So we will be providing a 30-day notice for both the intention to redesignate or pass new bylaws, as well as holding a public meeting. And at that public meeting, council will be present, and property owners are free to bring forward their objections or comments on the new bylaws. I also welcome people to, if they have concerns before that period in time, reach out to me at my contact information that's on the screen, and we can discuss any concerns or comments that somebody might have on their specific designation.
Sorry, Arthur, just
okay. What I've learned in talking to the members of the Historic Society, and what I've learned today, is that the salient and fundamental aspect of a heritage designated structure is the facade. And from what I'm hearing, and from my view of it, it's the curb appeal that really is what a heritage designation is all about. It's how it looks from the street, how people see it. And what I'd like to see in the bylaw amendments is something that is going to address the curb appeal, so that things are not done and activity is not done that destroys the curb appeal of particular designated historic structures. I'm going to cut my comments short because a lot of it has already been covered, so I won't, but let me give you an example. I'm looking at the Heritage book, and I'm looking at a picture of 37 King Street East. I think all of you are familiar with that home. That's what that building looked like from the street when that picture was taken. If you now stand at the same spot on King Street and look at the building, all you see is a grotesque Trump-like wall in the top of the building. This relates to a wall that was built in the adjoining property that in fact really destroys the curb appeal of 37 King Street East. That's just an example. If you look and right up and down King Street from end to end, that is the only place where that kind of a structure has been put up. So what I am feeling and asking the members that are reviewing the drafting of the bylaw is that that be addressed. That if any activity is going to take place that is going to destroy the curb appeal of a particular designated historic building, that there has to be approval by council before that kind of activity can go ahead. Those are my comments.
Anybody else?
I just like clarification on one thing. You stressed a couple of times about the justification for the designation. Is that a legal thing, or is that a bylaw thing, or is that just a personal take on stuff?
So there are criteria set out by the provincial government on what the designated property needs to meet. So as I mentioned in one of the examples, there are criteria in historic value, design value, as well as contextual value. And with newer legislation coming through, new designations at least need to meet at least two of those criteria. In the past, it had usually been one, but we're required now to write out a justification of which criteria the property meets and how it meets them. So one of the problems with the old bylaws is it basically just says this property is of historical significance to the township. It doesn't go into why, it doesn't really provide any details. So without being too subjective, because obviously history can be a little bit, or judging value of a property can be a little bit subjective. We do need to be able to make an argument for why a property is significant, and that's not necessarily just us trying to, kind of puff up the property. It's a requirement by the province under the Ontario Heritage Act to outline that criteria.
We do have another question virtually, if we don't have anybody in the audience that would like to ask another question. Will this limit the ability of the owners to implement green energy programs, such as updating windows and adding solar panels?
I would think most likely not. As we've mentioned, usually it's the street facing but exterior facade that is the most of concern for heritage designations. Usually even things like roofs can be kind of a questionable thing because it can be difficult to replicate historic materials. So sometimes that is a thing that gets kind of sacrificed in the efforts to seal a building envelope and protect the rest of the property. In terms of green energy, obviously that's something that we would want to encourage, is being able to take steps towards sustainability. However, again, it would likely need to be a thing that gets written approval from the township, whether it's sympathetic to the historic character of the building or not. That's not to say that it would be immediately rejected or approved, but it would probably have to be taken on a case-by-case basis to see what the proposed changes to, say, window assemblies, or whether solar panels were on the street-facing side of the roof, things like that. It would need to be kind of decided on case by case. So I'm not going to rule it out, but I'm not going to give it a universal go-ahead as well. It's also not my call.
Okay, if there's no further questions, we will. Okay, welcome to the microphone, please.
Connor, many designations will include a tree that is an integral part of the house. Are there any in Cavan Monaghan that, or that include a tree that could be considered a heritage tree and are part of the designation process?
Thank you, Cindy. That is something that we've sort of talked about internally, because there are a few properties around that have trees that were planted at a similar time that the house was built, especially down in Millbrook and a few more properties outside of the area. There are trees that are, older, over 100 years old, probably approaching over 200 years old. It's something that we would like to preserve because it does contribute to the heritage character of the property itself. I believe what we've come to at the moment is, if there's a historic tree on the property, it's included in the sort of general description of what makes the property significant. So that would be the paragraph. Yeah, so it would be in the sort of contextual paragraph that we've outlined. However, it wouldn't necessarily be outlined in the heritage attributes because we try to focus on the specific features of the building itself. However, it's not omitted from the bylaw completely. It's something that would still be taken into consideration, ideally.
We have another question online. Are new structures that don't connect to the designated building impacted by this?
In some cases, there are external buildings that are also included under the existing designation. So there are, that I can think of, at least one, maybe a few buildings that the designation includes an accessory building, like a garage that was built at the same time, or some designations include only, say, an outbuilding towards the like beside a farmhouse, sorry, a barn. In most cases, it would have had to be outlined already in the existing designation, and there's not very many that include things like a garage or an accessory building. It would be a different question, and I'm not sure exactly how to answer it if there was a new structure to be built. If it impeded the character of the exterior facade, then perhaps that would be a problem. But again, that would be something that we would deal with on a case-by-case basis, I would think.
I do see we have a member that has turned their video on virtually. Would you like to speak? And if not, that's fine. I just wanted to double check. You can shake your head yes or no. I'm the only one that can see you.
That's a wrap. Thank you all for coming tonight. We very much appreciate your questions, your comments, and your input. I think you can see from the presentation that this is a very serious project for township staff and council, and we are hoping to work with you as property owners and members of the community to make sure that the bylaws moving forward accurately reflect the heritage attributes that need to be protected, and that we can have a smooth process. As we've indicated, there will be a public meeting. There will be notice of that public meeting. Council will receive a report in the draft bylaws. They will receive comments from members of the community, and they will evaluate those comments before making a decision. And as Connor indicated, there is an appeal period after council does make a decision. So we want to be open and transparent. So we do welcome you to ask questions, provide comments anytime during the process. Staff is generally in the office between 8:30 and 4:30. Connor's contact information is on the slide. He will respond to you, and if he doesn't know the answer, he will call in extra recruits, and we will try to find the answer for you. Having said that, we might not be able to make everybody completely happy, but we will do our very best to create bylaws that accurately represent the key heritage features that need to be protected. So again, thank you for coming. You're welcome to stay for a few minutes and look at the information around if you wish, or ask staff questions. But if you want to go because it's a little bit foggy out, we appreciate that. And thank you again for coming.